Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. David Kessler's hands were black with engine oil when his phone buzzed for the third time that hour. He wiped his fingers on a rag that had seen better days and checked the screen. 3 missed calls from Reed's number. No voicemails. The auto repair shop smelled like burnt rubber and old coffee. David had been under a Chevy Silverado for the past 2 hours, replacing a transmission that should have been junk years ago. His back ached, his knees hurt, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps. He dialed Reed back. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. "Reed, it's me. Call back." David shoved the phone in his pocket and returned to work. Reed was probably teaching. Our class, 2nd graders, something like that. He'd call back during lunch. Except he didn't. By 5 o'clock, David had finished the transmission, changed the oil on 2 sedans, and replaced a cracked radiator. His boss, Tommy, a heavy man with permanent grease stains on his forearms, clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work today. Get out of here." David nodded and walked to his truck, an old Ford F-150 that had more rust than paint. He tried Reed again. Voicemail. Reed wasn't the type to ignore calls. He was reliable, almost to a fault. When their father died 3 years ago, Reed had handled everything. The funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the phone calls to distant relatives David didn't care about. Reed was the organized one, the responsible one. David was the one people crossed the street to avoid. He drove through Eugene as the sun dropped behind the trees. The city was small, surrounded by woods and factories that pumped smoke into gray skies. David had lived here his whole life, knew every street, every bar, every person worth knowing. His phone buzzed. Finally. But it wasn't Reed. It was a text. Things at home feel off. David frowned. The message was from 2 days ago. He'd read it then, replied with "What's wrong?" Reed had never answered. He scrolled up. There was another one from last week. "She's hiding something." David's jaw tightened. Lila, Reed's wife. Pretty face, sharp tongue, and a habit of making Reed look small. David had never liked her. The feeling was mutual. He dialed Reed again. This time, it didn't even ring. Straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. David changed direction, driving toward Reed's apartment across town. The place was a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that looked like it had been built in the 70s and never updated. Peeling paint, cracked parking lot, a broken gate that never closed. Reed's car wasn't in the lot. David parked and climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway smelled like stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener. One of the lights flickered on and off, casting shadows that danced against the walls. He knocked on Reed's door. No answer. "Reed?" Nothing. David tried the handle. It turned. Unlocked. His gut twisted. He pushed the door open slowly. The apartment was dark except for the flickering light from the hallway spilling inside. David stepped in, his boots heavy on the carpet. "Reed?" The living room was a mess. A picture frame lay face down on the coffee table. A wine glass sat on the kitchen counter, lipstick stained on the rim. The faint smell of bleach hung in the air, sharp and chemical. David moved through the apartment, checking the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom. No Reed. Then he heard it. A quiet sound, almost a whimper. He pushed open the bedroom door. Roy, Reed's 6-year-old son, sat on the floor between the bed and the wall. His knees were pulled to his chest, his face wet with tears. David's chest tightened. He crossed the room and crouched down. "Hey, buddy. It's Uncle David." Roy looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "Where's your dad?" Roy's lip trembled. "Mom said Daddy went away." David kept his voice calm. "Did you see him go?" Roy shook his head. "She said not to talk about it." David's fists clenched. He forced himself to breathe, to stay steady for the kid. "It's okay. You're safe now." He picked Roy up, carried him to the couch, and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen for a second before he dialed 911. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 2 officers, both young, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. David stood by the door while they walked through the apartment, taking notes, asking questions. "When did you last see your brother?" "Sunday dinner. A week ago." "Has he been in contact since then?" "Texts." He sounded worried. One of the officers, a woman with her hair pulled back tight, glanced at Roy. The kid sat on the couch, staring at his hands. Where's the mother? I don't know. She wasn't here when I got here. The officer made a note. We'll need to talk to her. David handed over his phone, showing them Reed's texts. The officer read them, her expression neutral. Things at home feel off, she read aloud. She's hiding something. Do you know what he meant by that? No, but he was scared. Reed doesn't scare easy. The officer handed the phone back. We'll file a missing person report. In the meantime, the door opened. Lila walked in, her purse over one shoulder, her coat buttoned to the neck. She stopped when she saw the police, her eyes wide. What's going on? David turned to face her. She looked the same as always, pretty in a way that knew it. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect. She didn't look like a woman whose husband had just disappeared. Where's Reed? David asked. Lila's eyes flicked to him, then to the officers. Why are the police here? Answer the question. Her expression hardened. I don't have to explain myself to you. The female officer stepped forward. Ma'am, we're investigating a missing person report. Can you tell us where your husband is? Lila set her purse down, her movements slow and deliberate. Reed left. We had a fight. He stormed out. When? 3 nights ago. David's blood ran cold. 3 nights. Reed had been missing for 3 nights, and she hadn't said a word. You didn't call anyone? David's voice was low, dangerous. You didn't think to mention that your husband was gone. Lila's jaw tightened. He's an adult. He can leave if he wants. With no car? No wallet? I don't know where his wallet is. David stepped closer. You're lying. Lila's eyes flashed. You always thought I wasn't good enough for him. Don't pretend this is about Reed. You just want to make me look bad. The officer raised a hand. Let's all stay calm. Ma'am, can you tell us what the argument was about? Lila folded her arms across her chest. Money. He was stressed about bills. I told him we'd figure it out, but he got angry. Said I didn't understand. Then he left. David studied her face. There were scratches on her wrist, thin red lines that looked fresh. Not from panic, from struggle. What happened to your wrist? Lila pulled her sleeve down. I scraped it on the car door. Looks like fingernails to me. Her face flushed. Get out of my apartment. This is Reed's apartment, and I'm his wife. Get out. The officers exchanged a glance. The female one turned to David. Sir, we need to ask Miss Kessler some questions. If you could wait outside. No, I'm staying. Sir, Roy's staying with me tonight. Lila's eyes widened. You can't just take my son. Watch me. The male officer stepped between them. Everyone needs to calm down. Ma'am, is it all right if your son stays with his uncle tonight? Just until we sort this out. Lila's face twisted, but she nodded. Fine. Take him. David picked Roy up from the couch. The kid wrapped his arms around his neck, burying his face in David's shoulder. As David walked past Lila, she hissed, he'll come back. He always does. David stopped. He turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. If he doesn't, I'll find out why. He carried Roy out into the flickering hallway, the door slamming shut behind him. David didn't sleep that night. Roy curled up on the couch in David's small house, a blanket pulled to his chin. The kid cried himself to sleep, whimpering between breaths. David sat in a chair across the room, watching him. Reed was gone. David knew it in his bones, the same way he'd known when their father was dying. Reed wouldn't just leave Roy. Not like this. When morning came, David called Tommy and told him he needed a few days off. Tommy didn't ask questions. He never did. David dropped Roy off at his neighbor's place, a retired teacher named Helen who'd known the family for years. She didn't ask questions either. She just hugged Roy and told David to do what he had to do. David drove to the school where Reed taught. It was a small elementary building with a playground out front. Kids swarmed the yard, screaming and laughing. David walked inside, past the front desk, down a hallway lined with crayon drawings. Reed's classroom was empty. Another teacher, a man in his 50s with glasses, poked his head out of the neighboring room. Can I help you? I'm looking for Reed Kessler. The man frowned. Reed hasn't been in all week. We've been trying to reach him. Did he say anything before he left? About problems at home? The man hesitated. He seemed stressed. Mentioned something about money. Said his wife made him sign some paperwork, and he wasn't sure it was a good idea. David's stomach dropped. What kind of paperwork? I don't know. He didn't go into details. David thanked him and left. His mind raced as he drove back to Reed's apartment. Lila's car wasn't there. Good. He used the spare key Reed had given him years ago and let himself in. The apartment smelled like bleach again. Stronger this time. Someone had been cleaning. David searched the place methodically. He checked drawers, cabinets under the bed. In the bedroom closet, buried beneath a pile of clothes, he found a folder. Inside were documents. A life insurance policy. Reed's signature at the bottom, dated 2 weeks ago. $500,000. Beneficiary, Lila Kessler. David's hand shook. He took photos of the documents with his phone, then shoved the folder back where he'd found it. $500,000. 2 weeks ago. Reed had been worried. Scared even. And now he was gone. David left the apartment and drove straight to the police station. He asked for the officer who'd taken the missing person report. She came out 15 minutes later, looking tired. Mr. Kessler, what can I do for you? David handed her his phone, showing the photos. Reed signed a life insurance policy 2 weeks ago. $500,000. Lila's the only beneficiary. The officer studied the photos. That's not illegal. He was scared. He texted me about it. Texted you about the policy? About her hiding something. The officer handed the phone back. I understand your concern, but we can't act on speculation. Your brother is an adult. Until we have evidence of foul play. So why just wait? We're doing everything we can. David walked out before he said something he'd regret. Over the next few days, David kept digging. He talked to Reed's coworkers, his friends, anyone who might have seen or heard something. Most of them said the same thing. Reed had been stressed, worried about money, mentioned Lila's spending habits, how she'd been pushing him to take out loans, to work more hours. David drove past Lila's diner, where she worked night shifts. Her car was parked out front. He sat in his truck across the street, watching. 2 hours later, she came out, climbed into her car, drove off. David followed. She didn't go home. She drove across town, past the industrial area, to a neighborhood David recognized. Rundown houses, chain-link fences, dogs barking behind gates. Lila pulled into a driveway. A man came out of the house. Tall, broad-shouldered, tattoos crawling up his arms. He leaned in a Lila's car window. They talked. She handed him something. He pocketed it and walked back inside. David took a photo of the man, the house, the license plate on the truck in the driveway. Then he drove home. The next day, David went back to Reed's apartment. Lila wasn't there again. He let himself in and searched more carefully this time. In the bathroom trash, beneath wadded tissues and an empty shampoo bottle, he found a phone case. Reed's initials were scratched into the back, but no phone. David pocketed the case and kept searching. In the garage, behind a stack of paint cans, he found a bag. Inside were Reed's wallet, his keys, and his wedding ring. David sat back on his heels, staring at the ring. Reed never took it off. He put everything in his truck and drove to the police station again. This time, the officer listened. She took notes, asked questions, but her face stayed neutral. We'll look into it, she said. That's it. Mr. Kessler, I understand this is frustrating, but without a body, without evidence of crime, he's dead. You know he's dead. The officer's expression softened. I'll do what I can. David left. He sat in his truck, hands gripping the wheel, and made a decision. If the cops wouldn't do their job, he'd do it himself. That night, David went back to Lila's apartment. He waited until she left for work, then let himself in again. This time, he searched her car. In the back seat, shoved under the passenger seat, he found a jacket. Men's size XL. It smelled like cologne and cigarettes. Not Reed's. David took it. When Lila came home at 2 in the morning, David was waiting in the parking lot. She parked and climbed out, her purse slung over one shoulder. David got out his truck and walked toward her. She saw him and froze. What are you doing here? David held up the jacket. Whose is this? Her face went pale. That's none of your business. It was in your car. You broke into my car? Where's Reed? Lila's hand shook. I don't know. You're lying. She turned toward her apartment. David grabbed her arm. She spun, eyes wild. Let go of me. Tell me where he is. I don't know. David released her. She stumbled back, breathing hard. Stay away from me, she said, or I'll call the cops. Go ahead. Tell them about the jacket. About the life insurance. About the man with the tattoos. Her face drained of color. She turned and ran into the building. David stood there for a long moment, then got back in his truck. He had what he needed. David didn't go home. He drove to the address he'd written down days ago, the house where Lila had met the man with the tattoos. It was past 3 in the morning, and the street was dark except for a few porch lights. David parked a block away and waited. At 6, a truck rumbled out of the driveway. The same truck from before. David followed it through town, keeping his distance. The truck stopped at a gas station. The driver got out, tall, tattooed, face hard and tired. David snapped a photo through his windshield. The man filled his tank, bought a coffee inside, then drove to an auto body shop on the edge of town. A sign out front read, Stone's Auto Repair. David pulled into a lot across the street and watched. The man unlocked the gate, drove inside, and disappeared into the shop. David wrote down the name of the business and ran a search on his phone. The owner was listed as Gareth Stone, age 38. A few arrests, possession, unpaid debts, one assault charge that got dropped. David sat back. Gareth Stone. The name meant nothing to him, but the face did. He'd seen it before, somewhere. Maybe at a bar, maybe at a fight. Eugene was small enough that everyone knew everyone, at least by sight. He waited until noon, then drove to a friend's place, a guy named Pete who ran a scrapyard outside town. Pete owed David a favor from years back, and David was ready to collect. Pete was in his office when David walked in, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and rusted car parts. David, long time. Need a favor. Pete grinned. Figured. What's up? I'm looking for a truck. Might have been sold for scrap recently. Reed's truck. Pete's grin faded. Reed? Your brother? Yeah. Pete leaned back in his chair. What's going on? He's missing. I think someone sold his truck to cover their tracks. Pete whistled low. That's heavy. Can you check your records? Pete pulled up his computer and started typing. After a few minutes, he shook his head. Nothing here, but I can ask around. What kind of truck? Ford F-250. Blue. VIN number's on file with the DMV. Pete wrote it down. Give me a day. David left and drove back to his place. Roy was still at Helen's. The kid had been quiet all week, barely eating, barely talking. David didn't blame him. The world had just turned upside down. That night, David sat at his kitchen table, staring at the evidence he'd collected. The jacket, the phone case, the life insurance policy, Reed's wallet and ring. It wasn't enough. Not for the cops. Not yet. But it was enough for David. The next morning, Pete called. Found something. A guy I know bought a truck matching that description 3 days after Reed went missing. Came from Stone's Auto Repair. Sold it cheap. Said it was damaged in a fire. David's pulse quickened. Where's the truck now? Already stripped for parts. But I got the VIN. Matches Reed's. Thanks, Pete. David, be careful with this. David hung up and drove straight to Stone's Auto Repair. He parked across the street again, watching. Garrett's truck was there, parked near the garage. David waited until Gareth left for lunch, then crossed the street. The gate was locked, but the fence was low enough to climb. David hoisted himself over and dropped into the yard. The place smelled like oil and rust. Old cars lined the lot, some stripped down to frames, others waiting for repair. David moved through the rows, checking each vehicle. In the back corner, behind a stack of tires, he found it. Reed's truck, or what was left of it. The cab was burned black, the paint peeled away, the windows shattered. David opened the driver's door. The interior was gutted, seats torn out, wiring exposed. But the glove box was still there. David pried it open. Inside, beneath a layer of ash, was Reed's wedding ring. The gold was melted, fused to a piece of metal that had once been part of the dashboard. David's hands shook. He pulled the ring free and slipped it into his pocket. Reed was dead. He'd known it for days, but now it was real. Solid. Undeniable. David climbed out of the truck and took photos of everything. The VIN plate, the burned interior, the glove box. Then he climbed back over the fence and left. He didn't go to the police. Not yet. First, he needed proof. Not just of what happened, but of who did it. David picked Roy up from Helen's that evening. The kid looked smaller somehow, like the week had hollowed him out. How you doing, buddy? Roy shrugged. They drove back to David's place in silence. David ordered pizza, but Roy barely touched it. He sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching. David sat beside him. You could talk to me, about anything. Roy didn't answer. David tried a different approach. You like drawing, right? Like your dad. Roy nodded. Want to draw something? Roy hesitated, then nodded again. David got him paper and crayons from a drawer. Roy sat at the kitchen table and started drawing. David cleaned up the pizza boxes, washed the dishes, trying to give the kids space. An hour later, Roy called out, "Uncle David." David walked over. Roy held up the drawing. David's blood went cold. The picture showed 3 figures. A woman with long hair, Lila. A man with tattoos on his arms, Gareth. And a third figure, lying on the ground, eyes closed. Reed. In the background was a building, a garage. David crouched beside Roy, his voice careful. Can you tell me about this? Roy's lip trembled. Mommy took me to see Daddy. When? That night. She said we were going for a drive. David's chest tightened. What happened? We went to a big place with cars. Mommy told me to stay in the car. But I looked out the window. What did you see? Roy pointed to the drawing. Daddy was sleeping. The man with the tattoos was there. Mommy said Daddy was going away, and we couldn't tell anyone. David's jaw clenched. He forced himself to stay calm, to not scare the kid. Did you see anything else? Roy shook his head. Mommy got back in the car, and we went home. She said if I told anyone, something bad would happen. David pulled Roy into a hug. The kid's small body shook against his chest. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. Roy sniffled. Is Daddy really sleeping? David closed his eyes. Yeah, buddy. He's sleeping. It was a lie. But Roy didn't need the truth. Not yet. The next morning, David called the detective assigned to Reed's case. Her name was Emma Lang, and she sounded skeptical when David told her about Roy's drawing. Kids have vivid imaginations, Mr. Kessler. He saw something. He described the garage, the man with tattoos. That's not enough for a warrant. David's grip tightened on the phone. What do you need? A body? Lang sighed. I'm sorry. I know this is hard, but we can't act on a child's drawing. David hung up before he said something he'd regret. Fine. He'd get the proof himself. David spent the next week following Gareth. He learned his routine. Early mornings at the shop, lunch at a diner downtown, evenings at a bar near the river. Gareth drank too much, talked too loud, and got into fights when someone looked at him wrong. David also kept tabs on Lila. She'd gone back to work at the diner, acting like nothing had happened. But David saw the cracks. She jumped at sudden noises. Her hand shook when she poured coffee. She looked over her shoulder every time the door opened. David knew that feeling. Guilt. One night, David followed Gareth to the bar. He sat in the corner, nursing a beer, watching Gareth get drunk and start a fight with another patron. The bartender kicked him out. Gareth stumbled to his truck and drove off, swerving. David followed him home. Gareth pulled into his driveway, staggered inside, and collapsed on the couch visible through the window. David sat in his truck, thinking. Lila and Gareth had killed Reed. He was sure of it, but he needed proof. A confession, something that would bury them both. He thought about Roy's drawing, the garage, the man with tattoos, and then he thought about the phone case he'd found in the dumpster outside Gareth's shop. An idea formed. The next day, David bought a prepaid phone from a convenience store. That night, he sent a text to Gareth from an unknown number. Need to move the rest. Meet me where it happened. Tonight, 11 p.m. He signed it with Lila's name. Then he drove to the storage yard near the woods, the place where Pete had said Reed's truck had been found. David parked his truck behind a row of shipping containers and waited. At 10:45, Garrett's truck pulled into the lot. He got out, looking around, his breath misting in the cold air. David stepped out of the shadows. Gareth jumped, his hand going in his pocket. Relax, David said. I just want to talk. Gareth squinted at him. Who the hell are you? Reed's brother. Garrett's face went pale. He took a step back. I don't know what you're talking about. David moved closer, his voice calm. Tell me where my brother is. Man, I don't know. You sold his truck for parts. Don't lie. Garrett's jaw worked. Look, I didn't do anything. Lila. Lila what? Gareth ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around. She said it was an accident, that he fell, that we just needed to get rid of the truck. David's fists clenched. Where is he? Gareth swallowed hard. I don't know. I didn't. Where is He, Gareth cracked. The words spilled out in a rush. Near the river, by the old logging road. I buried him there. But it wasn't my idea. Lila planned the whole thing. She drugged him, made it look like an accident. I was just supposed to get rid of the truck, but she panicked and I had to. He stopped, realizing what he'd said. David pulled out his phone. He'd been recording the entire conversation. Gareth's eyes widened. You bastard. David turned and walked back to his truck. Gareth shouted after him. You can't prove anything. I'll say you forced me to say that. David didn't look back. That night, David sat in his kitchen, staring at the recording on his phone. He had what he needed. A full confession. Gareth had admitted to burying Reed. Lila had drugged him. But something stopped David from calling the police right away. He played the recording again, listening carefully. Gareth had said Lila planned everything. That she'd convinced Reed to sign the life insurance policy. That she'd drugged him. That Gareth was just supposed to help clean up. David thought about it. Gareth was a thug, a criminal, but Lila was the mastermind. She was the one who'd manipulated Reed, who'd cashed in on his death. She deserved worse than prison. David opened the recording file and edited it. He deleted the part where Gareth said he helped bury the body. He cut out the section where Gareth mentioned Lila drugging Reed. What remained was Gareth admitting he buried Reed, that he did it alone, that Lila had nothing to do with it. It wasn't true, but it would work. David saved the edited file and leaned back in his chair. Lila and Gareth had killed Reed together, and they'd both pay. But Gareth would take the fall for the disposal, and Lila would be nailed for the rest. David smiled. It wasn't justice. It was better. David didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the edited recording on his phone, and thought about Reed. About the life he'd had, the kid he'd left behind, the brother David had failed to protect. Reed had been scared. He'd reached out, and David hadn't acted fast enough. But he could act now. At dawn, David sent the recording to Detective Lang, along with the photos of Reed's truck, the life insurance policy, and Reed's texts. He attached a note. Anonymous tip. Check the river by the old logging road. You'll find Reed Kessler there. The man in the recording is Gareth Stone. He buried the body. Lila Kessler planned the murder for the insurance money. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. Then David sent the same package to the local news station. By noon, the story was everywhere. The news anchor's voice was grave as she read the details. A local man, missing for weeks, found dead near the river. A recording implicating his wife and her accomplice. A $500,000 life insurance policy signed just days before his disappearance. David watched the broadcast from his couch, Roy asleep beside him. At 2 o'clock, the police arrested Lila at the diner where she worked. David heard about it from Pete, who'd heard it from a friend who'd been there. Lila had been carrying a tray of food when the officers walked in. She dropped it, the plates shattering on the floor, and screamed when they read her rights. She kept saying it wasn't her fault, Pete told David over the phone. That Gareth did it all, but she didn't know. David hung up and turned on the TV. The news showed footage of Lila being led out of the diner in handcuffs, her face twisted in rage. An hour later, they arrested Gareth at his shop. He didn't fight. He just stood there, hands behind his head, as they cuffed him and put him in the patrol car. David turned off the TV and sat in silence. The trial took months. David attended every day, sitting in the back row, watching. Lila's lawyer tried to paint her as a victim. A wife driven to desperation by a controlling husband. A woman who'd made mistakes, but hadn't meant for anyone to die. Garrett's lawyer claimed he'd been coerced. That Lila had manipulated him, threatened him, forced him to help. But the evidence didn't lie. The prosecution presented the life insurance policy. Reed's texts. The recording where Gareth admitted to burying Reed's body. Lila's financial records showed she'd been in debt for months, drowning in credit card bills and loans. The policy had been her way out. Roy's drawing was entered as evidence, despite the defense's objections. The prosecutor explained what Roy had seen that night. His mother at the garage, the man with tattoos, his father lying on the ground. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Lila Kessler, guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. Gareth Stone, guilty of accessory to murder tampering with evidence, and illegal disposal of the body. Lila's face crumpled when the judge read the verdict. She turned to Gareth, who sat at the defense table beside her, and screamed, "You said you'd take care of it. You said no one would find out." Gareth stared at her, his expression cold. "You're the one who killed him. I just cleaned up your mess. Liar. You wanted the money too." The judge banged his gavel. "Order." But the damage was done. Lila and Gareth had turned on each other, each one blaming the other, each one trying to save themselves. David watched from the back row, his face expressionless. The judge sentenced Lila to life without parole. Gareth got 30 years. David stood and walked out before the courtroom erupted in whispers. Months passed. Winter turned to spring. The reporters stopped calling. The news moved on to other stories. David got custody of Roy through the courts. Lila's parental rights were terminated. She tried to fight it from prison, but her lawyer told her it was hopeless. David sold Reed's apartment and used the money to buy a small house outside town. It had a yard, a garage, and enough space for Roy to grow up without memories of what had happened. Roy started school. He made friends. He drew pictures of superheroes and spaceships instead of garages and sleeping men. Some nights, he still woke up crying. David would sit with him until he fell back asleep, his hand on the kid's shoulder. David went back to work at the auto shop. Tommy never asked questions about what had happened. He just clapped David on the back and said, "Good to have you back." On weekends, David took Roy fishing at the river. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. One evening, as David fixed an engine in the garage, Roy walked in carrying a wrench. He was 9 now, taller, steadier. "Can I help?" David smiled. "Sure, buddy." They worked in silence for a while. Then Roy spoke. "Uncle David." "Yeah." "Did you ever forgive Mommy?" David's hands stilled. He set down the wrench and looked at Roy. "Forgive?" "No, but I made sure she can't hurt anyone again." Roy nodded, like that made sense. David picked up the wrench and went back to work. "That's enough," he said quietly. Roy handed him a bolt. "That's enough." They worked until the engine purred, smooth and steady, the sound filling the garage like a promise. Outside, the sun set behind the trees. The world moved on, and David Kessler, who'd never backed down from anything in his life, knew he'd done what needed to be done. Reed was gone, but Roy was safe, and in the end, that was enough.